everyone, welcome to the community classroom. This is part 2 of our discussion on sex and gender, and this is a response and clarification video, and it's a response to a young person who has returned to college and is taking classes, a psychology class in particular, and has some questions regarding the distinctions between sex and gender. And so there's a little bit of confusion out there. This individual is not the only one who has some concerns about the confusion. A lot of people are confused about it, and it seems to get a little bit more confusing as time goes on. And so what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the relationship between sex and gender. We're going to talk about the similarities and the distinctions. So we're going to cover gender roles. We're going to look at things like the definition of gender. We're going to look at this dynamic of masculinity and femininity. We're going to look at gender stereotypes. We're going to look at Sandra Bim and some of her theories. We're going to look at what's known as gender performance. We're going to touch on cis and transgender. We're going to also look at the distinctions in terms of research and redefining gender and segregating gender and sex and then disaggregating them. And so we're going to look at all of those issues, and then we're going to close this up with a discussion about culture and why there may be so many issues related to gender confusion and gender conflict and gender wars in the world today. Particularly, we're focusing on the United States, but this could apply to anywhere where there is growing confusion regarding sex and gender and those distinctions. And this is Dr. Tracey McCarthy, psychologist, attorney, and educator. If you see this video on any other platform other than Dr. Tracey McCarthy, it is stolen and unauthorized. Let's get started. There are lots of ideas about gender and about gender roles and about sex roles, and so we're going to have some points of clarification today so that you can begin to have more clear conversations about those distinctions and what it means to discuss sex and what it means to discuss gender and how they are similar and how they are different. And you can see on the screen that you see some individuals actually performing gender, and so people have some ideas about who should be performing gender in what particular way, and we're going to get into that. And many people have lots of ideas about sex and gender and how those things are played out. And you even see this performance of gender all the way up to the highest levels of government. And as we discussed, if you haven't seen the video on sex, I encourage you to go back and look at it so that you understand what sex is before we jump into what gender is. One of the things that's important to note is that in terms of law and policy currently, sex subsumes gender. And basically, sex is this big umbrella. And in terms of the law, gender is one of the things that falls under that umbrella. So this gives you the indication that there is a distinction between sex and gender, because sex is that bigger umbrella, and then gender is operating under that umbrella in terms of the law. Now, if you have not had an opportunity to watch the video on sex versus gender, I encourage you to do that so that you have a better understanding of what we're talking about as we go forward in this discussion about gender, because gender and sex are not, in terms of this discussion, they are not the same thing. And so, as you recall, sex is about the biological classification of maleness or femaleness or some other variant. And when we talk about gender, we're also talking about a kind. So we're talking in relation to the sexes, but when we're talking about gender, we're talking more about the social dynamics. We're talking about cultural differences, not simply biological ones. And so that's where people get a little confused, because there are similarities in terms of this term, in terms of the roots of the terms. And so that's why it can get confusing, and people are increasingly using these words interchangeably. And so that's creating a significant amount of confusion. So people are thinking that gender is the biological difference, just like sex is the biological difference. So they're seeing these as the same thing. But what we're going to be talking about are the sociological, the psychological, the cultural dynamics related to gender. And one thing I find interesting to note is that there are different definitions of gender. And so you will find in the clinical world, in the psychological world, in the medical world, that gender is basically about the behavioral, cultural, and psychological traits that are associated with a particular sex. So the biological, cultural, and psychological traits that are associated with maleness or males, the behavioral, cultural, and psychological traits that are typically associated with females or femaleness. Now, what's interesting is that there's that definition, but then there's a quote-unquote kid's definition of gender or child definition of gender. And for children, the definition that's being given to them is it is the state of being male or female, which is very much synonymous with sex. And so you can see how there might be some confusion. So if teachers are teaching in schools that gender is about really sex, it's really about sex, meaning it's really about being simply male or female, there can be some confusion, particularly as they go up in education and the conversation about gender becomes more nuanced and there is more of a discussion and more of a focus on the behavioral, cultural, and psychological dynamics related to sex versus it simply being about sex itself. Now, while gender is about the psychological and social dynamics related to sexual identity, it's also political. And that's when the issues become somewhat heated as people have these discussions about the implications of gender for politics, the implications of gender for power. And so the Brady Bunch is a great example of how gender roles were played out in this particular series. Those of you who are younger, you may not even recognize who these people are on the screen, but this is the Brady Bunch. You have Mike and Carol Brady and their children. And if you ever get a chance to watch the Brady Bunch, you will get to see gender being played out extraordinarily well in terms of stereotypes. And so in biology, what we talk about is sex. So we talk about this biological classification of maleness or femaleness. But when we get to gender, we are not necessarily talking about maleness or femaleness in and of itself. What we're talking about is this understanding of oneself or another as masculine, feminine, or androgynous. Now, many people say that there are more types of gender, but we're just going to be talking about the basic ones. And again, somebody might disagree. I'm giving you the older versions prior to us becoming so advanced. And so this is the old stuff, old tried and true stuff. So basically what it's about is the psychosocial understanding of oneself as masculine, as feminine, or androgynous, or some other configuration, but it really always is in relation to this idea of masculinity and femininity, and it's always in relation to something related to the biological classification of maleness or femaleness. And another important thing to remember is that this psychosocial understanding of oneself or another as masculine, feminine, or androgynous, this can either be a lived experience or it can simply be a perception. And so it doesn't have to be grounded in, unequivocal reality. It simply is, this is something that an individual experiences, or this is related to a person's perception. And reaching back, we have the Jeffersons, and so we have George and Wheezy Jefferson, And this is another family where gender was played out in a very stereotypical fashion. And so there was a solid gender identity, which was related to the sexual classification of the individuals. And they played out roles based upon their understanding of gender. And those roles were fairly stereotypical. So if you get a chance to go back and look at the Jeffersons, you'll get to see George Jefferson playing out this highly masculine role and Louise Weezy playing out this highly feminine role. And of course, these are stereotypes. So it's stereotypically masculine and stereotypically feminine. And one of the things you might notice with the picture of the Brady Bunch and even with this picture of the Jeffersons is that the male figure is the one who is out front and everyone else is behind that male figure. And in both of these situations, the male figure is also the breadwinner. And so he is the figure that everyone in the family is pretty much depending on in terms of finances. One of the reasons there is so much confusion and consternation regarding gender and sex and those conversations, period, is it's because of stereotypes. And so a lot of people have generalizations based upon whatever their observations are related to males and females and what constitutes masculinity and what constitutes femininity. And people don't talk about androgyny anymore, but we used to talk about androgyny before we became so sophisticated. And so there are lots of stereotypes that people have about how males are supposed to behave and how females are supposed to behave. And this is based upon their observations, their bias about how people are supposed to behave, and it includes themselves. So that's one of the things that sort of gets conversations, really sidetracked, and, people become very volatile because people have all of these ideas about what it means to be masculine and feminine, and then they want to also project that onto other people. So that's where the problem usually comes, is that it's not enough for them to just have those understandings or make those observations. They want to then generalize, and then they want to project onto other people, and then they want to often push people to operate within the stereotypes that are inside of their heads. And so you can see how this can become a very confusing dynamic. And so you'll often have people becoming very insistent and belligerent when people don't act consistent with whatever it is the person has in their head about how a man is supposed to behave, or how a boy is supposed to behave, or how a woman is supposed to behave, or how a little girl is supposed to behave. And so that's where we're going to try to tease all of this out so that people have a better understanding about gender, and they can better understand that it's really a psychosocial dynamic. It is not the biology that most people think it is. And so it's so fluid, and it can be manifested in a variety of ways. You can have all sorts of stereotypes based upon your family, the culture that you come from. And so it's going to be different for everyone. And so it's really helpful when people allow other people to be who they are and accept that people are different. And here we have some stereotyped depictions about what it means to be masculine and what it means to be feminine. And so what it means to perform gender, what it means to have a particular gender identity. And again, you will see where you have particular toys that are indicated for little boys. And so over in the corner, those transformer types of toys, you have your tool kit, and then you have things that are stereotypically understood as toys for little girls. So little dolls with pink hair or whatever color hair they might have. You have the little kitchen set up top. You have different clothing. And so stereotypically, females are understood to perform gender in a way that would indicate they would wear these very uncomfortable high heel shoes up at the top. And then you also have this dynamic where the male is expected to play this sort of protective role. And so you can see that in the young spouses. You've got I Dream of Jeannie, again, a very old show, and then you have another couple over on the right, and the male is, stereotypically supposed to be taller than the female. And so there are lots of stereotypes about masculinity and femininity, and a lot of these things are operating on an unconscious level, and so people aren't generally thinking it out as they are performing it. They're just sort of, operating on automatic pilot. We've become so sophisticated in our discussions about sex and gender that we sort of leave out the pioneers, and Sandra Bem is an old pioneer, or she was an old pioneer in terms of sex and gender theory, and she had what was known, as she has, she had the sex role inventory. And the sex role inventory is just basically a little assessment that people can take, and you can actually take it online, and it's kind of fun. And you can take it, and it helps you to get a better understanding of your own sex roles and your own sex role identity, and how that relates to gender roles and how that relates to gender stereotypes. And so one of the things that's helpful in terms of the sex role inventory is it gives you the criteria, and then it helps you to see how far in one camp or the other you may fall in terms of masculinity or femininity or androgyny. Now, it used to be that androgyny was just, sort of a standard way of operating for many people. And so it was pretty much accepted that people, generally speaking, had a little bit of, the masculinity if they were females, and if they were males, they had a little bit of the femininity in terms of sex roles. However, the conversation has changed now significantly, and so people don't talk in these very basic terms anymore. However, these very basic terms are still applicable. And I actually think that if people talk in these very basic terms, that it'll be much easier for people to understand and for people to have better conversations regarding what's going on today in terms of politics, in terms of policy, in terms of power. One important thing that Sandra Bem talked about was this idea of the gender schema. And the gender schema is basically the schema, the sort of map that you have in your head, the ideas that you have in your head regarding gender. And what she believed was that gender is cognitive and cultural, meaning gender comes from the way we think about things. And so it's not just something that is, inborn. It's cultural, meaning there's a nurture component to it. It's not just about nature. So there is this nurture component to it, and it really is about the way that we are thinking about sex roles and the way we are thinking about masculinity and femininity. And these gender schemas come from many places. We get them from, child rearing, from your parents, you get them from school. You're getting a lot more of it from school now than in the past. In the past, the conversations in terms of sex ed used to primarily focus on the basics, and so just human development sorts of things. But now they have become, again, much more sophisticated. There are all sorts of gender schema messages from the media and various cultural groups. The other thing Sandra Bem talked about was this idea of sex typing. And this is really important. And sex typing basically talks about the extent to which one's gender is in line with their understanding of their sex. And so for one, you have sex typed, and that means that the sex typing, the classification of maleness or femaleness, is in line with the gender, so that psychosocial understanding of oneself as masculine or feminine. So in other words, if a person is classified as female, then the sex typing where it's in line with gender, then it would be consistent with femininity, okay, because that's the one that goes with females, femininity. And so cross-sex type is where it's in line with the opposite gender. Okay, and so if you're talking about a female and we're talking about the opposite gender, we're not saying that the person is acting or typed consistent with the opposite sex. It's the opposite gender. And so it's the psychosocial understanding of oneself as masculine. Okay, and so then you have androgynous, where there's the integration of both genders. And so there's a little bit of masculinity and a little bit of femininity. And then you have undifferentiated, where there's just a lack of sex typing altogether. And so there's no consistent attachment to femininity or masculinity, or there's no consistent performance of either of those. There's no consistent identification with either of those, and that's for a male or a female. So let's look at some of these stereotypes. We're going to first look at masculine stereotypes, and then we're going to look at some feminine stereotypes. These are not the only ones, so this is not an exhaustive list. But these are some prominent ones to think about. And so when people tend to think about masculinity, which means what they tend to think about maleness, what they often think about in Western societies is this idea of a person who is strong, who's independent, protective, fearless, confident, active, dominating, aggressive, unemotional, messy, mechanical, and athletic. And so these are some of the things that people think about when they think about this male identity or that masculine identity. And so when someone is classified as a male and they do not manifest these traits, they are sometimes seen as less than masculine, or the flip, they are sometimes seen as feminine. Sometimes they may be seen as androgynous, but it's often seen as feminine. So in other words, if a male presents as weak, if a male presents as dependent, if he's not taking care of himself, if a male fails to be protective in terms of women and children, then he is seen as less masculine and more feminine. If a male is fearful, and perhaps that might be why he's not being protective. If a man is fearful, he's seen as less masculine. If a man lacks confidence, also seen as less masculine. A man who is passive versus active, or submissive versus being dominating. If a man is fails to be aggressive, and again is passive. If a man is extremely emotional, then that is seen as not masculine and more feminine. And so, called being in their feelings. And so when that is manifested, again, that is seen as a sign of not being completely a man or masculine. If a man is extremely neat versus being messy, he can be seen as more feminine versus masculine. If a man is not mechanical and he's more artsy, he can be seen as less masculine and more feminine. Again, if a man is not athletic, or at least interested in athletics, then he can often be perceived as feminine and not masculine. Now again, because this is about felt experience and perception, this can be different. There can be some confusion, because a male may experience himself as these things, but he may not be externally perceived as being these things. And so you can see where there's a little bit of a clash there. And again, it's important to remember these are stereotypes, meaning these are generalizations based upon someone's observation or their belief about how all men should operate based upon a sample. And so again, this will not necessarily apply to other cultures. These are just some standard identifiers in terms of stereotypes, masculine stereotypes for men, particularly in the West, particularly in the United States of America. Now, when thinking about this, it's important not to place value judgments on any of this, because again, these are just stereotypes. And so if you place too much value on something, this is when you get into the hyper mode. And so if someone understands masculinity as being aggressive, and that's the way that you show masculinity, then you may have an individual who becomes overly aggressive in an attempt to perform that masculine role, and it may not even be consistent with how they feel or how they experience themselves authentically. So, it's not It's not a good thing to place a lot of value judgments on these different stereotypes. They just are what they are, and they're just part of our discussion. Now we're going to look at the feminine stereotypes, and with the same admonition. These are just stereotypes, and so you don't want to place a lot of value judgment on them. And of course, again, they are stereotypes, so they do not apply to all females or all women. But some of the stereotypes for femininity, that psychosocial understanding, would be gentleness. And so if a woman is performing in a gentle manner, that's considered feminine. Showing empathy versus being cold-hearted, being sensitive, being caring in terms of others, showing what's known as sweetness versus sourness, being compassionate, being agreeable versus disagreeable, being very nurturing, being deferential, also submissive. Being accommodating and passive and receptive. And so when females manifest these stereotypes, there is often the perception that they are being feminine. And again, as with males, these are stereotypes, and it's important to note that that's what they are, and so not to place value judgments on them, because if anyone is doing all of this 24/7, they are probably going to be just as off balance as a man is going to be if he's performing those masculine stereotypes 24/7. Now, one of the important things to note about the feminine stereotypes is there is an other orientation, and so there is a lot of selflessness involved in these feminine stereotypes, and so there's a focus on taking care of other people instead of taking care of the self, and so that's pretty noteworthy. There's an interesting theorist, is an educator, Jordan Peterson, and he talks about this idea of agreeableness as being a part of the reason why women have lower salaries than men. And so he doesn't look at it necessarily as this is, an inherent discrimination dynamic, but that sometimes the way that females perform gender results in these lower salaries and not rising as high as they can in terms of the corporate world. And so for him, and when he's discussing this, he's talking about basically sort of the downfall of performing these feminine stereotypes outside of perhaps the sort of home environment. And so here you see this dynamic of gender performance, and gender performance is basically how someone performs this idea of masculinity or femininity. And so these are all presumably female in terms of sex, and they are performing gender. And one of the things that you'll note is that you have people performing gender in different ways. And so depending on who you're talking to, these individuals, they look different, they are dressed different, they are performing different roles. They may or may not have the sense of themselves as being masculine or feminine in performing these roles. However, someone on the outside may look at them and may experience them as performing a role that is masculine, feminine, or androgynous. One of the things to note when it comes to females taking on masculine roles, there is more acceptance of this than males taking on feminine roles. And part of this has to do with value again. The masculinity and the traits, the stereotypes that go along with masculinity are more valued in society, and so they are placed on a pedestal more so than the stereotypical traits that are assigned to femininity. And so when women mimic men in terms of dress, that tends to be seen as more admirable, sort of like they are, performing up versus performing down. And so when a male performs in a feminine way, that is a down performance. And And when you look on the screen, we have also presumably individuals who are biologically male and performing variously either feminine roles in terms of gender performance or what would be stereotypically considered masculine gender roles. One of the things that's important to note when it comes to males, as we've already touched on, is when males perform inconsistent with masculinity, those masculine stereotypes that we discussed. When they perform inconsistent with that and they take on more feminine stereotypes, then they are down performing, and they are often seen as less valued in terms of men, in terms of their masculinity. Now, this down performance is not simply about attire. It can be things like, if you refer back to the list, you could start off with protection. And so if a male is not operating in a stereotypically protective masculine way, then that's sort of a strike against that masculinity. So if a man's not just, being protective in terms of women, protective in terms of children, protective in terms of the elderly, and this could be not just family members, but just being protective out in society, that is considered feminine versus a masculine trait. If a man is not acting consistent with being confident, with being athletic, things like that, that is considered sort of a down performance, because you're talking about when you're in a patriarchal society, when men are not acting consistent with that sort of patriarchal, that patra, meaning that father, that male mandate, they are seen as and treated often as less than. And so being androgynous does not weigh out the same way with males as it does with females in a patriarchal culture. Now let's touch quickly on this idea of cisgender and transgender. One of the complicating things about these terms is that they both depend on objectification and stereotypes regarding sex and gender. And so what you have is this belief in someone's head that there is a particular way for a male to be male or a male to be masculine. There's a particular way for a woman to be female or feminine. And so when that happens, people get it in their heads that you can either be consistent with your gender and sex, or you can be inconsistent with your gender and sex. But what this requires is that someone has put it in their head that they understand what it means to be consistent. So they have an idea of what it means to be female, and that female goes with a particular way of being feminine. And when individuals are cisgendered, they are thought to have a gender that is consistent with their biological sex classification. Same thing with transgender. There is a belief that there is an understanding of what it means to be masculine or feminine, and that when a person is transgender, that they are acting inconsistent with the classification of their sex and the understanding of the sex role or gender identity that goes along with that. And although there's a lot of conflation of sex and gender in common parlance these days, as you can see, researchers, academics tend to see those dynamics as different. They do tend to see sex as a biological dynamic and gender as a psychosocial, cultural dynamic. And you know this to be the case simply because you have those distinctions in the titles. And so you have sex and gender, sex, gender, and society, sex and gender, sociological perspectives on sex and gender. And so you can see that there is a perception in terms of research that there is a distinction between sex and gender. And here you can see from this older American psychologist article that there's a discussion regarding the redefinition of sex and gender. And there is this, in the article, this understanding, this discussion of gender being related to the sociocultural traits ascribed to males and females. And this is actually a pretty good article because it actually explains, it has a discussion about the differences between sex and gender and how the research on both of those dynamics, how the research is different. And so when you're talking about gender research, there is more of a focus on sociocultural factors that might contribute to the sex differences. And so there is a look at both that sort of dynamic of nature and nurture. One of the reasons that sometimes this stuff becomes confusing is because there is this conflation, and there is sometimes there's an assumption about what it means to be masculine and what it means to be feminine based upon sex characteristics. And so some people might think that being nurturing is something that is sort of just inborn in terms of females simply because of the way that they are made biologically. And nothing could be further from the truth. People are not just, automatically born being nurturing or confident based upon their biological classification of maleness or femaleness. Now, of course, people vary, and so there may be more of a tendency because of biology, because of your hormones, because of just physical makeup, the way that males and females are generally made different. And so they, have different body mass, different fat mass, different muscle mass. And so there are some things that are going on different there. Also hormonally, males and females, the hormones are similar, but they operate in the body in very different ways. And so you will see some differences that are biosocial differences. But that does not mean that all females or all males are experiencing themselves the same way, or they are operating in the world the same way, because not every female even has the balances in terms of hormones the same way. Every female, her hormones, those hormones are different for every single female. For every male, his hormones are different. Every male has a different hormonal makeup. And so you may not see this consistent dynamic across the board where males and females are acting out masculinity and femininity in consistent ways across the board. One interesting thing to note in this article is this discussion about gender being another word for sex and also being another word for women. And this is really important because when people take classes in terms of gender studies, or they're in a gender studies program, the focus does tend to be on the feminine. And so there will be a focus on things like women's studies. And so there's less of a focus on men and masculinity. Although there may be classes related to men and masculinity, the focus tends to be on women and women in gender studies and things like that. Now, people might offer that this is because women have been excluded or minimized in terms of general studies, and so there is this need for this area of study. Same thing goes with ethnicity or race. So you'll have different studies. So you might have Hispanic studies, you might have Africana studies, and that comes from this perception that there is insufficient attention given to that particular group in the regular mainstream educational process. And so the same thing with women. But it is important to note that when you see that gender studies dynamic, what you'll usually see will be a focus on women. And so some people might get misguided and find themselves in a gender studies dynamic and think that they're going to be talking about all of the genders, and that may not be the case. And this article is a good article because it does talk about the similarities and the distinctions related to sex and gender, and it also talks about the use of gender, sex and gender, in the feminist paradigm. And so those of you who are not familiar with feminist paradigms, I encourage you to do a little reading on that. There are a lot of assumptions about what feminism is and is not, and I hear a lot of that among some content providers. but you are encouraged to do a little research so that you actually understand what feminism is about, because there is a lot of misunderstanding about what feminism is about and about the different, what's called the waves of feminism. So you need to understand, in order to have a coherent conversation about feminism, you need to have a coherent understanding of the different waves of feminism so that you know what you're talking about when you're having these dialogues. And this is an older article, but it's important. It's a law review article. And what this article is arguing is that sex and gender should not be separate, and that they should be considered one entity. It should be considered one thing. Again, the problem with trying to make sex and gender the same thing is the same problem that you have with the discussions of cisgender and transgender. Embedded in this is this belief, this sort of objectification of people, and this belief that there is a certain way to be masculine, and there's a certain way to be feminine, there's a certain way to be male, and there's a certain way to be female. There is already sufficient confusion about sex and gender floating around out there, and so there's no need to add to that confusion by attempting to assert that sex and gender are the same thing. You have one that is basically focused on the psychological and the sociological, and those things are pretty fluid. You know, what's psychological, is pretty fluid. It's not as consistent as something as simple as whether you see primary or secondary sex characteristics or not. And so when you start getting into the psychological and the social, and you're trying to make them the same as the biological, you're going to run into problems. Now, there are people, because of spiritual traditions, that unequivocally believe that they are one and the same, but I encourage people to look at the dynamics of sex and gender from a broader lens, and so that they can have more nuanced conversations about sex and gender and the implications for those understandings. One of the problems with conflating sex and gender is that individuals, when they do that, they're also leaving out this dynamic of culture, and the dynamic of culture is an overarching dynamic that should not be minimized. One of the things that happens when people try to conflate sex and gender is that they forget that everyone does not see the world through the same lens that they see the world through. Now, the majority of the world is patriarchal. However, there are other systems operating across the globe. And so where you might have some cultures that are patriarchal, patrifocal, or patrilineal, you might also have cultures that are matrifocal, matrilineal, or matriarchal. And so you have a problem. You're going to have a clash when you have individuals who are from a patra-focused or a patriarchal, patrilineal culture, and they are trying to then project their beliefs and their values onto another culture that's matriarchal, matrifocal, and matrilineal. Because in those different cultures, you're going to have the sexes operating inconsistent with what the other culture believes those sexes should be doing. And so you might see this with, for instance, in Africa, you have the Akan, and the Akan are matrilineal, even though they are surrounded by a number of patrilineal cultures or clans. They themselves are matrilineal, and so the way that women and females operate inside of that culture may vary from the way that they operate in terms of a neighboring culture. And similarly, in America, you have groups like the Choctaw and the Chickasaw that tend to be matrilineal. So they have a matrilineal clans. Just like the Akan. And so the way that women operate and the way that women are understood in those cultures will be different from the way that they are understood and they operate in perhaps a neighboring tribe or clan. This may also be part of the reason why you have so much consternation about gender dynamics in the United States. I know people love the idea of diversity, but with diversity comes the need to manage that diversity. And oftentimes there is a push for diversity without the requisite push for the adequate management of it. And so right now, you have a lot of gender wars, and one of the things that people might want to start thinking about is when you see these gender wars, what you might be actually seeing is people who are trying to operate across cultures. And so you may have people who, in their heart, their mind, and their soul, they are patrilineal, and they are trying to get along with another person who is from a matrilineal culture. And there are clashes because in their hearts, their minds, and their souls, they are seeing the world in different ways, and they are experiencing themselves in different ways. And so while diversity is a great thing, can be a great thing in many instances, when it comes to things like this, you may see more problems than you see solutions. And so instead of maligning people because they appear to come from a culture that is inconsistent with another person's culture, people might want to start asking questions about how the other families are operating. And so what often happens in a matrilineal culture, for instance, is that the children belong to the mother's clan. And so the children don't go with the father's family. The children go with the mother's family. And the uncle becomes more prominent in terms of the role in the child's life. And so that would be the mother's brothers. And so you have to think about these things when you see some of these clashes that are going on. People think because they are the same skin color that they are the same people, and they may not be the same people. And so just because people grew up in the United States, it does not mean that they are the same people. And so there may be a lot of clashing because what you're looking at perhaps is a clash of cultures. And so you may have people that they don't even know it, but they're coming from different tribal traditions that they are carrying down the line without being fully conscious of it. And so there may be a lot of consternation and a lot of angst when those two types of groups try to get together, whether you're talking about friendships, whether you're talking about marital relationships, or talking about parenting and things like that. And so it's something to keep in mind when you're thinking about some of these gender wars. These gender wars may not be just political dynamics. They may really be related to people's families and their origins. And as we wrap this up, this is just a basic example of classifications on an application. This is for the application for a Social Security card. And so you can see where it says your name, your date of birth, that sort of information, place of birth, citizenship, ethnicity, and then race, and then very specifically sex. So it doesn't say gender. Now, again, as we are becoming more sophisticated, sometimes these are conflated, and that is what is adding to the confusion. And so it would probably be helpful if people who create these applications would be very, very clear about what they are asking for. So if they're asking for sex, they need to be very clear that they're asking for sex and not use the word gender in place of sex, because that adds to the confusion. And as we wrap up, it's important to remember that not everyone is going to see the world the same way that you see the world. They're not going to experience the world the way that you experience the world. Everyone is an individual. And so it's important to remember that, and it's important to remember that every person has a right to their experience and their perception, and it may not be the same as your experience or perception. As a matter of fact, it won't be the same as your experience or your perception. And also don't allow other people to define for you what it means to be masculine or feminine or androgynous, because it's going to vary from person to person. And one of the things we want to be careful about is maligning people and chastising people about them not living up to whatever our standards happen to be about their masculinity or femininity. So if someone is not sufficiently nurturing and that's what you require in your interaction with that person, it's probably best to just go find someone else who is sufficiently nurturing. If you were looking for someone who is sufficiently protective and the individual that you're dealing with is not sufficiently protective, it's probably best to just go and find someone else who you experience as being sufficiently protective, versus maligning people for simply not living up to whatever your dreams happen to be. Remember, knowledge is power. Take care and see you soon.